Well, I'd like to introduce myself. I am based out in Worcester, and I teach at ATI. So that's really the majority of my job description. But I also do a bit of research, and over the last several years, my colleague Alex Lindsay and I in Columbus have been doing a range of different types of trials looking at interseeded cover crops. And just to kind of kick things off, I'd like to see a show of hands of folks who've planted cover crops or worked with cover crops in some capacity. All right, that's great. I'm not in the chapel today, but I may be preaching to the choir. So I am a sucker for a good pocket knife. And one of the things I love about cover crops is the fact that whatever the circumstance or whatever goal you might have in agriculture, there's often a cover cropping strategy that can be employed to meet those needs. And in many regards, cover crops offer a lot of opportunities for various soil quality and soil health benefits and other strategies to help to enhance your operation. So in many of the talks that you've heard over the last several hours, I'm sure that you've seen some of those benefits highlighted. But I also want to be realistic and help us to understand and address some of the challenges that we face when we're trying to integrate cover crops into our cropping systems. One of the things that stood out to me very early on has been highlighted in this survey that was done about 10 years ago, but I think it really continues to be true today. One of the main challenges for cover crops has been having a narrow window to plant cover crops after grain harvest. And one of the challenges from my standpoint, many of us we can go plant some cereal rye and get reasonable benefits from that. But if our goals are to fix nitrogen or to break up soil compaction, we are limited in terms of the menu of cover crop species that we can plant after grain harvest. So I wanted to look at that challenge and begin to look at some strategies for dealing with that. So there's a lot of different interseeding methods out there. Some of the more widespread are various broadcasting methods, maybe aerial interseeding late in the corn crops growing season, or potentially with a highboy. In both cases, one of the main challenges is seed-soil contact. You're broadcasting on the surface, and you're reliant on rainfall to enhance that seed-soil contact, and that can work. It's often very efficient in terms of covering acres, but you're limited by that weather and that seed-soil contact. So another option that we've been looking at is a high-clearance drill, and this particular high-clearance drill was designed at Penn State, and it provides the opportunity to get that seed in the ground. You're a little less dependent on rainfall and weather. And in the context that we're working in, you can interseed up to about V6, maybe V7 in certain circumstances. And if you're doing that early in the season, that enhances and expands the menu for the different cover crops that you can be successful with. Downside is it still requires specialized equipment, and if you're using a two-row model like we have here, it takes a long time to cover acres. That said, while those of us at ATI and Ohio State, we've got two of these two-row models that we can put on a trailer and haul out to do on-farm trials, but there are other options. Here we've got an example of an air drill that's set up for 12 rows. So there's other options if you're looking to cover more ground efficiently.
Have you just taken an old drill, removed some row units so you can interseed?
I've seen people do that. Ours was specially designed for this sort of setting.
Repeat that question.
The question was, have you seen instances where people are removing row units off of existing drills and getting reasonable results? So I have seen some of that. But what we've got, and I'll highlight that here in just a little bit, it allows us to spray herbicide. We've got 2 tanks on our high clearance drill, so we can spray glyphosate as we are interseeding, and we can also put down side dress nitrogen, so we can do 3 operations at once, and so that makes it a little bit more compatible. So some of the earliest work on interseeding that I've come across was out of Pennsylvania, and they were looking at interseeding into silage corn systems. And the advantage there is that since you're taking the silage off earlier, you get a longer window for that cover crop to grow and establish. And based on this picture, I mean, you can get some pretty good stands established. Also provides opportunity to graze and provide forage for your livestock. And just to highlight some of those early studies on that, this is data from one of my colleagues at Cornell, Matt Ryan, who has done work on this for several years now. And one of the things that he found was that silage yield was not adversely impacted by interseeding the cover crop, and in whether he was using a annual ryegrass or a grass legume mixture, in most cases he got pretty good establishment of that cover crop, upwards of 1 to 2 tons of vegetation over the course of the next spring. Now, the next step, from my perspective, is to look at it in grain production systems. And so, as I was starting on this series of experiments, I had several questions that were of interest to me. First, do no harm. The old adage that doctors employ to their patients. Would competition from the cover crop essentially reduce corn yields? And that was something that I was always looking for. Second, if we are integrating that cover crop and incorporating that into the soil, would there be potential benefits on yield the subsequent year, so-called legacy effect? Other questions were, are there going to be some corn yield environments that are simply too competitive for the cover crop to be successful? And I'll show some data that speaks to that here in just a little bit. Similarly, are there some cover crops that are more well-suited for growing underneath that corn canopy, which is a challenging environment for a cover crop? It's shady, it can get dry later in the summer, and are some species more suitable for that? And then finally, similar to that, can we look at shade tolerance within and among different cover crop species and use that to help us select species that are a good fit for this type of system? So I'm going to share several experiments that I've done over the last few years. First was an experiment where we grew corn back to corn. It was a 2-year trial in 2015 and 2016. And we interseeded, we had 5 different treatments. We had a control where no cover crop was established. We had tillage radish. We had red clover, balanza clover, and annual ryegrass. And we interseeded at the V5 stage with our high clearance drill. And just to give you a sense of the broader operations, we generally started with a fairly aggressive burn down to knock down the weeds that were in the field previously. We used glyphosate, 2,4-D, and Sharpen. And that Sharpen in there was designed to be a short duration residual that would not prevent the germination of cover crops after a 3 to 4 week window. We then used some vertical tillage to prepare the ground, and we seeded our corn around the 21st of May using a Roundup Ready variety. And then we interseeded at V5 at the same time as applying our glyphosate. We did a similar experiment in 2016 with a little bit wider selection of cover crop species. In this case, we added forage collard, berseem clover, and crimson clover, and used a similar approach. We just looked at it in 1 year. We didn't look at this the subsequent year. So what did we find from this first experiment? So we've got data here where we're looking at grain yield and cover crop biomass in the fall of 2015, and then spring 2016, and then the following 2016 grain yields. And a couple of interesting things that I want to highlight. First, in our first year, we didn't see any significant increase or decrease in yield, compared to the controls. So if you look at all of the different cover crop treatments that we interseeded, in many cases, they actually were a little bit better. These were not significantly better, but at least marginally better. And in that particular year, which was not a great year for corn at this site, in general, we got between 5 and 600 pounds per acre of vegetation in that fall period. The subsequent spring, we saw some other interesting results. We saw that the tillage radish was completely winter killed, which is what we would expect. And I should note that if you look at the percent green cover data, which represents an image of the vegetation from above taken down on top of the cover crop or weeds, thing that we noticed is that tillage radish really did a pretty nice job of also smothering any weeds that were present. So that was quite interesting. Other thing that we noticed is our legumes and our annual ryegrass came back pretty strong in the spring, and in particular the red clover and balanza clover did well in terms of overall biomass in the spring that we then turned in and planted back to corn. And then that same subsequent year, we did those same cover cropping treatments in those fields again. So what do we see in terms of yield in that second year? Interestingly enough, in the red clover and the balanza clover treatments, we did see some significant yield increases. Now, roughly 18 to 20 bushel per acre improvement as compared to the no cover crop control. So that was, I think, encouraging. And we certainly didn't see any negative impacts, which is kind of the first and most important thing. Now, go ahead.
One of the things they say when you change a system, you should leave it that way for 3 or 4 years so you can actually get away from some of these transitionary things and you can see how it's going to roll out. It seems like a lot of these experiments are 1 or 2 years and we're not really getting enough of the system to see what it will roll out as.
I would agree with that. I don't have the question here is oftentimes with university experiments, you have a couple of years in a trial, and then you move on to something different. And wouldn't it be better if you had a longer term period to begin to see some of the more long-term effects? I would agree. Unfortunately, I don't have data to speak to that at this point. So this is another site also at Worcester, a one-year study. And again, we're asking the question, what are the impacts of these cover crop treatments on yield? Little bit more variability in the grain yields in this particular year. But again, if you compare any of the cover crop treatments with the exception of, any of the cover crop treatments to the control, the fact that they've got all either have an A or a B means that they were not significantly different. We did still see some small reductions in the crimson clover and red clover, but I'm not prepared to say that that was because of the cover crop. We also saw the crimson clover in this particular year did quite well the following spring. The reason I like the crimson clover is it tends to wake up pretty early in the spring, matures a little bit more quickly, and puts on a lot more biomass before you need to terminate in time to get your corn in. So that does offer some opportunities. I will note that crimson clover variety is a variety called Kentucky Pride, and it tends to overwinter better than some other varieties that I've seen. Now, we've had pretty good success in Worcester. I can't say the same about some of the other sites that we've tried. In particular, South Charleston, that same year, we basically replicated our experiment, and we didn't really get very good establishment of the cover crop at all. Our corn yields in general were quite a bit better, 225. Again, didn't see any yield differences across any of those treatments, but the reason for that was the cover crop biomass was very, very small, less than 100 pounds in most cases. And so what we felt we were seeing was an effect of that dense shade in a higher yield environment restricting the establishment of that cover crop. It was also dry in the summer, so we got some probably negative impacts of that. We'll say that the tillage radish did a bit better than some of the others. So all of that said, the reminder here is we haven't seen any negative impacts on yield. In fact, we've seen a couple instances of legacy benefits. But we're also seeing some challenges here as well. In this, what I did is took data from these experiments, plotted them, and we're plotting corn grain yield by fall cover crop biomass here. And what we're seeing is that as corn grain yield increases, the fall cover crop biomass decreases. And again, this is not because of anything that the cover crop is doing to the corn, but rather what's happening with the corn, that dense corn stand, rapid growth in the spring is tending to shade things out.
Have you decided to maybe try more upright leaf architecture that allows a little bit more sun in versus the stuff that more quickly canopies?
It's a very good question. The question was, have you tried varieties that maybe have a more erect architecture and allow more light penetration? I think is a great question. It's not something I've tested yet. But towards the end here, I'll be curious to get some ideas on how we can expand the set of questions we're asking to deal with this issue. Question that I did ask was shade tolerance among the cover crop. And so I decided to take those cover crop species and take them out of the field and put them in the greenhouse under different grades of shade cloth. And just to get a sense of which ones are more tolerant to shade than others. And we did this basically at no shade, 50% shade, and 90% shade. And did this for about 60 days. That was the length of our study. A couple of things that we noticed. At 50% shade, there was actually very little impact on overall vegetation for our brassicas. And even at 90% shade, they maintained between 45 and 50% of their biomass. So I thought that was kind of interesting to see. And if we go back to this figure here, you'll notice that our brassicas, which I have in green, tended to not be depressed in terms of their production as quickly as the other legumes. We also did this with our legumes, and we did see, probably a good, 60% of the production was still available at 50% shade, but at 90% shade, they tended to be dramatically reduced in terms of the amount of vegetation they produced. And then I calculated what I'm calling a shade tolerance index based on the dry weight at 50% shade divided by the dry weight at 0% shade would be a 50% shade tolerance index, and then the similar calculation for 90% shade tolerance. And what do we see? That, again, those brassica crops did quite well in maintaining their ability to produce vegetation at 50% shade, and they didn't drop off as steeply as the legumes did in the 90% shade. There's still some other good performers. Red clover did pretty well in that trial, and I'm not saying that legumes can't have a place in a shadier environment. It's just that the brassicas seem to do quite well. So just to summarize, main things that I saw is that in general, if we're interseeding at the V5 stage, V6 stage, the risks to the corn crop are pretty minimal. In fact, the risk is bigger in terms of not getting a good establishment of your cover crop in higher yield environments. We also saw that if you get good establishment in the fall and that carries through to good biomass production in the spring prior to plowdown, you have an opportunity for subsequent yield benefits, particularly with your legumes. There's probably a nitrogen effect being seen there. That said, successful establishment of your cover crop, even with a drill, is still very much reliant on timely rain. There's no way to substitute for that. Just an observation over several years of work on that. Finally, higher yield environments, and the threshold there I think is still to be determined, but in general, when I had sites that were higher than 200 bushels, generally that shady environment is more restrictive, and in general the brassicas showed a little bit more shade tolerance than others. So to kind of speak to your question there towards the end, what are some options that we have looking forward, particularly in this higher yield environment? One that I've seen a lot of folks curious about is wider row spacing, so-called solar corridor concept. I haven't tried this yet myself, but from what I've seen, makes sense. You get a little bit better establishment with the potential for maybe some yield loss, but not dramatic. Plant the cover crop a bit earlier, maybe V2 to V3. Again, not something I've tried yet. I've tried cover crops at the same time as planting corn, and I wouldn't recommend that. It becomes a weedy mess. And then finally, plant shorter, potentially more erect cultivars. And with that, I guess I would like to open the floor up for a few questions and maybe some thoughts on how we can populate this list a little bit to help me ask good questions that are relevant to you guys. Go ahead.
Well, perhaps I missed it. Did you rate either cereal rye or ryegrass according to shade tolerance?
I do have, the question is, did I rate either cereal rye or ryegrass according to shade tolerance? I didn't show any of that data, but I did look at that. I just can't remember exactly off the top of my head where it kind of stacked up. I think the annual ryegrass did pretty well in terms of the shade tolerance. I just don't have it here today.
Yeah. On your cover crop, or on your one that you had the crimson clover planted in the fall that had the tremendous amount of biomass, would you have next year try to not kill anything, plant the corn into that, and see if you'll get 100 or 90% weed suppression with the clover? Let the clover go.
So the
Go dormant, and your corn plant will get its nitrogen from the nodule.
It's a very good question. He's proposing, if you've got a nice stand of crimson clover, potentially planting the corn directly into that crimson clover without, terminating that. I think it's an interesting idea. It's not something I've tried yet. Do you have any experience with that type of an approach that you could share with us?
No, but I've seen the tests on it where they did that, but it does go dormant. I saw it mainly when they did it in alfalfa.
Okay.
And the alfalfa went into blossom, but then it basically went dormant.
Yeah.
Because it didn't cut it off and it regenerated it all.
Yeah, I've seen some studies where they've defoliated the cover crop with a paraquat or something along those lines. It's a chemical defoliant, but it doesn't kill the cover crop. The cover crop, comes back. And the idea there is to set it back a little bit, allow the corn to get established, but not to totally kill it. So I've seen some results from that that are interesting. Can't say that I've tried it.
You'd have to do that before the corn emerges.
Yeah. Yeah.
In some small plot work, I've seen where the bowls were in under the crimson clover and just cleared it all, took out all the corn.
Yeah.
I mean, every single stalk.
Yeah.
Just something to be aware of.
Yeah.
Charlie White at Penn State has done a lot of this stuff before they put the interseeder out for commercialization. And one of the things he thought after 5 years is instead of having the 3 rows of interseeder, he would go down to 2. And that might handle the shade tolerance a little bit better by being right in the center of the row.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the question there is, if over time you can modify your interseeder row spacing, maybe go with 2 rows as opposed to 3. I've seen people that have started with 2 rows, to begin with. So, all right, another question.
Your herbicide program on your corn is predominantly dependent on glyphosate. With the growth of water hemp and in some cases palmer, how are you going to get around that?
It's a good question. One study that I've been interested in trying in this setting is to switch it over to a Liberty Link option, using some of those the Liberty Link traits and then coming through and hitting that. I've seen some data out of Penn State where that didn't work as well as glyphosate. So I do recognize that it is probably a little more reliant on glyphosate in this context. I have also had several growers borrow my interseeder to use in organic plots, and they're coming through and interseeding after their final cultivation, and that's worked reasonably well as in it also. All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate your guys' feedback and comment.